It wasn't the kind of thing Sarah ever imagined finding herself doing, hunched over her laptop in the dead of night, lost in websites she had no business exploring. But then she turned, and there he was, Jake, her stepson, silhouetted in the doorway, eyes fixed on the screen, her breath hitched, her heart slamming against her ribs. He didn't have to say a word. The air in the room thickened, everything shifting in that silent, charged moment. It had begun like any other Tuesday evening in their Upper West Side brownstone. The city hummed outside, but inside, the house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Mark, her husband, was in Chicago for another one of his endless conferences, leaving her alone with Jake. She'd grown accustomed to these stretches of solitude. Their marriage had become a predictable rhythm, Mark's absence almost more comforting than his presence. That night, Sarah had poured herself a second glass of Pinot Grigio, maybe a third. She wasn't counting. The day had been a blur of editing manuscripts, the same tired romance tropes recycled again and again. But it wasn't just the work. It was the weight of it all, the dull ache of life as a woman teetering on 55. She'd accepted certain harsh truths about herself. Invisibility had become her cloak, not just to Mark, but to the world. Women like her, they were rarely seen, rarely desired. She was someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's stepmother. Labels, not reflections. No one truly looked at her anymore. The wine warmed her, a heavy, sluggish buzz. She'd retreated to bed with her laptop, seeking a flicker of something, anything. It started innocently enough, a random banner ad flashing across a website, a click born of idle curiosity. That click had spiraled into a rabbit hole she hadn't anticipated, a hidden world of videos, stories, entire websites catering to desires she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten they existed. Older women, younger men, the forbidden fruit, gleaming in the digital orchard. Time blurred as she scrolled, lost in those stories, those headlines that sent heat crawling up her neck, stealing her breath. Just reading, she told herself, just looking, harmless. No one would ever know. But then she heard it, the soft groan of the bedroom door hinges, the faint creak as it swung inward. She froze, fingers hovering over the keyboard. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the old house settling, the familiar sounds of an empty night. But then she felt it, a presence. Someone standing just beyond her. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, she turned her head. The blood seemed to drain from her face as her eyes met Jake's. He stood in the doorway, barefoot and silent, his gaze laser-focused on the laptop screen. The harsh glow of the screen painted his face in stark relief, highlighting the shock, or was it something else, in his expression. She was paralyzed, lungs seizing, unable to draw breath. Jake looked at her, then back at the screen. She knew what he was seeing, the website's lurid header, the suggestive images, the words she hadn't even had time to close out. Shame burned through her. She wanted to explain, to deny, to say anything, but her throat constricted, words failing her. And then, as if the silence wasn't suffocating enough, he stepped closer. A hot flush erupted across her chest as she slammed the laptop shut, the sharp click echoing through the room like a gunshot. She braced herself for the explosion, for the questions, the jokes, the accusations. Anything, but he said nothing. Jake's face remained unreadable, a mask of calm as he stood there, staring not with judgment, not with anger, but with something else entirely. Something that tightened her chest, stealing the air from her lungs. Finally, after an eternity stretched out in agonizing silence, he spoke. "Good night, Sarah." His voice was low, too calm, as he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her suspended in stunned silence. The door clicked shut behind him. She remained frozen, her hands trembling, staring at the closed laptop. Her mind raced, replaying the moment over and over, blurring the lines between reality and imagination. What had he seen? How much had he understood? Jake hadn't laughed, hadn't teased. That would have been easier, something she could dismiss as a fleeting moment of humiliation, a shared awkwardness they could both pretend never happened. But the way he looked at her, she couldn't shake it off. It wasn't pity, it wasn't disgust. It was something else, something she didn't dare name. She sank back against the pillows, pulse hammering in her ears, cheeks still burning, chest still constricted. She wanted to tell herself it was nothing, that she was reading too much into it, that Jake was probably already back in his room, shaking his head and laughing about what a sad, lonely woman she'd become. But she didn't believe it. She'd seen the subtle shift in his expression, the way his gaze lingered, as if seeing her for the first time. Hours bled into the darkness. The laptop sat on the nightstand beside her, a loaded weapon. She didn't dare open it again. didn't dare move. When sleep finally claimed her, she could still see him standing there, silent, watching. And the worst part, the part that chilled her more than anything, was the heat that flickered in her chest every time she replayed that moment, the unsettling warmth that refused to dissipate. She was trapped in a loop, replaying the encounter, endlessly dissecting his expression, wondering what he was truly thinking as he looked at her like that, like she was undeniably a woman. The next morning, the weight of the previous night settled heavily on her chest, a leaden blanket of unease. She'd barely slept, Jake's face imprinted on the back of her eyelids, his calm, unreadable expression, the way he'd turned and left without a word echoing in the silence of her mind. She tried to rationalize it, to convince herself it was nothing, an overreaction fueled by too much wine and too little sleep. He probably thought it was funny, a harmless moment of embarrassment they would both soon forget. And yet, as she stood in the kitchen, pouring herself coffee, her hands trembled. Footsteps on the stairs, a jolt shot through her, and she gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white. A second later, Jake walked into the kitchen. She didn't dare look up, focusing intently on the steaming coffee, as if the dark liquid held the answers to the swirling questions in her mind. She could feel him there, his presence filling the room like an invisible pressure. She waited, every nerve ending screaming, for him to say something, to laugh, to tease, to release the tension, to let her know he hadn't taken last night seriously. But he didn't. He poured himself a glass of water, leaning casually against the counter across from her. She could feel his eyes on her, watching, studying, in a way that made her skin prickle. It was different now. He was different. Or maybe it was her. She forced herself to take a deep breath, finally lifting her gaze to meet his. "Morning," she managed, her voice tight, strained. He nodded, taking a sip of water. "Morning." His tone was neutral, carefully bland, but his eyes lingered on hers a beat too long, as if waiting for her to shatter the carefully constructed normalcy. She didn't. She turned away abruptly, pretending to tidy the already spotless counter, her movements jerky and unnatural. The silence stretched, heavy, unspoken, thick with the weight of what they both knew. Finally, Jake pushed off the counter, the casual movement a stark contrast to the tension radiating from him, and walked out of the room. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her heart hammering against her ribs. The rest of the day was a frantic blur of distraction. She threw herself into work, editing chapters of a historical romance novel so saccharine it would normally induce sleep. But even as she stared at the words on the screen, her focus fractured. All she could think about was Jake. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him standing in the doorway, looking at her like that. Shame burned in her cheeks just thinking about it. But there was something else too, a flicker of something she wasn't ready to acknowledge, not even to herself. The way he looked at her hadn't been judgmental, hadn't been disgusted. It had been curious. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, a thrill of forbidden electricity, and she pushed it away as quickly as it came. She couldn't think like that. She wouldn't. As dusk began to bleed into the city skyline, she couldn't bear to sit at her desk a moment longer. She needed to escape the suffocating confines of the apartment, to breathe air that wasn't thick with unspoken tension. She grabbed her coat and keys, deciding to walk through Central Park, hoping the cold evening air would clear her head, wash away the unsettling thoughts. But when she opened the front door, Jake was there, leaning against the doorframe, phone in hand. He looked up, startled, and she froze, caught in the sudden intimacy of the encounter. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his tone carefully casual. "Just needed some air," she replied, clutching her coat tighter around her, a shield against the city chill and the sudden, unexpected encounter. He nodded, pushing himself off the doorframe, stretching his arms above his head. "Mind if I join you?" The question caught her completely off guard. For a heartbeat, she didn't know how to respond. She wanted to say no, to tell him she needed to be alone, to escape the suffocating tension between them, but the words wouldn't come. "Sure," she said finally, the syllable barely audible. They walked in silence, side by side, down the quiet, tree-lined street bordering the park. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the sidewalk. She shoved her hands deep into her coat pockets, her heart pounding against her ribs, trying to ignore the invisible current that hummed between them, a silent, vibrating tension. She kept waiting for Jake to say something about the night before, to break the suffocating silence, to laugh it off, to acknowledge the elephant in the room. But he didn't. Instead, he walked beside her, quiet, hands in his own pockets, his face a carefully constructed mask of calm. The silence became unbearable, a physical weight pressing down on her. I didn't hear you come in last night, she blurted out suddenly, the words too loud in the still evening air. Were you out late? He glanced at her, a faint, almost imperceptible smile curving his lips. Not too late. She nodded quickly, focusing on the rhythmic crunch of their footsteps on the pavement. She didn't know why she'd asked, didn't care where he'd been, or at least she shouldn't. They reached the park entrance, the familiar wrought iron gates looming against the twilight sky. Jake stopped, turning to face her. The faint glow of a nearby streetlight illuminated his face, casting shadows that sharpened his features, making him look older, harder. Are you okay? He asked, the question catching her off guard, making her blink up at him, startled. What? Yeah, I'm fine. You seem distracted, he said, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She felt her cheeks flush, and she looked away quickly, focusing on a distant street lamp. I'm fine, she repeated, the lie flimsy, unconvincing, even to her own ears. You're lying, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She opened her mouth to argue, to deny, but the words caught in her throat, choked by the suffocating truth. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it throbbing in her ears. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the tension between them thick, palpable. The silence stretched, filled with something unspoken, something she didn't want to name, didn't dare acknowledge. Finally, Jake took a step closer, his voice dropping even lower, a hushed intimacy. You don't have to be embarrassed, you know. She looked up at him sharply, her breath catching in her throat. He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. They both knew what he was talking about, the unspoken shame hanging between them like a shroud. She wanted to say something, to tell him he was wrong, that there was nothing to be embarrassed about, but her voice failed her, words dissolving into the thick silence. All she could do was stare up at him, frozen, caught in the beam of his unwavering gaze. Jake didn't move, didn't break eye contact. He just looked at her, his gaze steady, unflinching, as if he could see right through her carefully constructed facade, right into the tangled mess of emotions churning beneath the surface. Her chest tightened, her pulse racing, the silence growing heavier, more charged with every passing second. Finally, he turned away, breaking the spell, his voice calm, almost detached. We should head back. It's getting late. She nodded quickly, her hands trembling, following him back toward the apartment, her mind spinning, her thoughts a tangled mess of confusion, shame, and something else, something she still refused to admit to herself. When they got back to the brownstone, Jake disappeared upstairs without another word, leaving her alone in the living room, staring at the empty space where he'd been standing, the lingering ghost of his presence still palpable in the air. She sank onto the couch, the plush cushions offering no comfort, her heart still racing as she pressed her hands to her face, the weight of the unspoken hanging heavy between them. What was happening to her? What was she letting happen? That night, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ornate plasterwork on the ceiling, the silence of the house pressing in on her. She could hear Jake moving around in his room across the hall, the faint creak of the old floorboards sending jolts of nervous energy through her. She told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining things, reading too much into a fleeting moment, a shared awkwardness that didn't mean anything. But deep down, a cold, hard knot of truth tightened in her stomach. Something had shifted between them, a tectonic plate moving beneath the surface of their carefully constructed reality, and she didn't know how to stop the tremors. The days that followed were a blur of strained silence and simmering tension. She kept her head down, a self-imposed exile, hiding in work and household chores, anything to avoid being alone with Jake for too long. It wasn't that he said or did anything overtly wrong. No, it was far worse than that. He didn't say anything at all. There were no teasing remarks, no awkward jokes about what he'd seen on her laptop, just a quiet, lingering presence that seemed to grow heavier, more suffocating, every time they shared the same space. It was as though that single charged moment had created something between them, an invisible thread, an unspoken connection, something dangerous. She tried to pretend she was imagining it, that she was just paranoid, projecting her own guilt and shame onto his innocent presence. But she wasn't. She could feel it, that invisible string pulling at her, tightening whenever he was near, a silent, insistent tug. One evening, Mark called, his voice distant, preoccupied, to tell her he'd be staying another day in Chicago. He was supposed to be home by morning, but the client needed more face time, as he always said, the corporate jargon grating on her ears, a constant reminder of the chasm that had grown between them. She didn't remember what she mumbled in response, the words mere formalities. He didn't care what she thought, and she realized, with a chilling sense of detachment, she didn't care where he was. After she hung up, she poured herself another glass of wine, the ritual becoming a nightly comfort, and settled onto the couch in the living room, the silence of the apartment amplifying her unease. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the soft tick of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. She tried to lose herself in the book she was holding, a slim volume of poetry, but the words blurred together, meaningless symbols on the page. Her mind spun in circles, replaying the scene in the bedroom, Jake's face in the doorway, the weight of his gaze, the unspoken question hanging between them. She tried to push away the feeling that had been shadowing her for days, the unsettling awareness that she was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something forbidden. And then Jake walked in. She hadn't heard him approach, lost in her own swirling thoughts. She only noticed him when she felt him there, standing in the doorway, watching her, his presence suddenly solid and real in the quiet room. She looked up sharply, her heart giving a nervous flutter as his eyes met hers. He didn't say anything. Didn't have to. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken desire. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but her voice wavered, betraying her carefully constructed indifference. He shook his head, walking into the room and settling onto the other end of the couch, the worn leather creaking softly under his weight. The silence stretched, heavy and charged as he leaned back against the cushions, his long legs stretched out in front of him. The casual posture a stark contrast to the tension radiating from him. She kept her eyes fixed on the book in her lap, pretending to read, tracing the lines of verse with her finger, but she could feel him watching her, his gaze a tangible weight. "What are you reading?" he asked finally, his voice low, a murmur in the quiet room. "Nothing interesting," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Then why are you pretending to read it?" The question startled her, cutting through her carefully constructed defenses. She looked up at him, her breath catching when she saw the faint, almost amused smile playing on his lips, as if he knew exactly what he was doing, knew exactly how to dismantle her carefully constructed walls. She didn't answer, couldn't. Her heart was pounding in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs, and she couldn't understand why. Why his simple question had thrown her so completely off balance. "You've been avoiding me," Jake said quietly, the words hanging in the air, a soft accusation. A chill ran through her even though his tone remained calm, almost conversational. He was right, of course. She had been avoiding him, desperately, clumsily, but hearing him say it out loud, acknowledging the unspoken tension, made it feel real, undeniable, like an accusation she couldn't deflect. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied quickly. Too quickly, forcing her eyes back down to the book, the words still blurring on the page. Jake didn't respond, but she could feel his gaze lingering on her, a silent weight pressing down on her. She refused to look up, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the page, pretending to read, pretending she couldn't feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the frantic flutter in her chest. And then she felt it, the couch cushion shifting slightly as Jake moved closer. She froze, her fingers tightening around the book, her breath hitching in her throat. She could feel him beside her now, close enough that the warmth of his body brushed against her arm, a subtle, electrifying contact. "Sarah," he murmured, her name a soft breath against the silence. She closed her eyes, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst, a frantic, desperate rhythm. She wanted to tell him to stop, to stand up, to go back to his room, to leave her alone in her carefully constructed world of denial. But the words wouldn't come, trapped in her throat, suffocated by the unspoken desires that had been simmering beneath the surface for too long. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, she turned her head to look at him. He was close, too close, his face inches from hers, his eyes searching hers, probing, questioning, his expression unreadable, a complex tapestry of emotions she couldn't decipher. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the silence between them crackling with unspoken tension, charged like static electricity. She should have moved, should have said something, anything, to break the spell, to pull back from the precipice. But she didn't. She couldn't. Jake's hand lifted slowly, deliberately, his fingers brushing against her cheek, the touch light, hesitant, as if he were testing the waters, waiting to see if she would pull away, recoil from the forbidden contact. She didn't. Her breath caught in her throat as his thumb traced the line of her jaw, the soft, feather-light touch sending a shiver of electric sensation through her. She felt frozen, paralyzed by the storm of emotions swirling inside her, a chaotic vortex of fear, guilt, desire, a dizzying, intoxicating mix. "This can't happen," she whispered, the words barely audible. a fragile protest against the rising tide of desire. "Then tell me to stop," he murmured back, his voice a low, husky whisper, his eyes searching hers, pleading, challenging. She opened her mouth to say the words, to utter the simple denial that could shatter the fragile tension, but they wouldn't come. She couldn't say them. She realized, with a jolt of terrifying clarity, that she didn't want to say them, didn't want him to stop. Because the truth was, the terrifying, exhilarating truth was that she didn't want him to stop. Jake leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers, the faintest of kisses. A question, not an answer. A silent inquiry into the depths of her unspoken desires. She felt her body respond before her mind could catch up, her fingers trembling as they curled into the soft fabric of his shirt, gripping, clinging, seeking purchase in the storm. And then she kissed him back, the hesitant touch dissolving into something deeper, something more urgent, more desperate. It was like something inside her snapped, a dam bursting, releasing a torrent of pent-up emotion, of long-denied desire. The kiss deepened, intensified, and all the guilt, all the shame, all the carefully constructed rules she'd been clinging to melted away in an instant, consumed by the sudden, overwhelming heat. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer, crushing her against him, her body molding against his in a way that felt both shocking and utterly, terrifyingly right. She felt weightless, dizzy, as if the world had shifted beneath her feet, tilting on its axis, leaving them suspended in some forbidden space, a realm where only they existed, where only their desires mattered. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, gasping for air, she was disoriented, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm. She stared at him, her eyes wide, pupils dilated, reflecting the chaotic storm raging within her. "This is wrong," she whispered, the words barely audible, a fragile protest against the intoxicating rush of adrenaline. "Then why does it feel right?" he replied softly, his voice a low murmur, his gaze unwavering, holding hers captive. She didn't have an answer. She didn't have the strength to argue, to dissect the tangled web of emotions that had ensnared her. Instead, she stood up quickly, abruptly, putting distance between them, creating a physical barrier against the overwhelming pull of his presence. She tried to catch her breath, her hands shaking as she ran them through her hair, her mind spinning, a chaotic whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "I can't," she said finally, her voice weak, trembling. "This can't happen." Jake didn't argue, didn't try to stop her, didn't plead or cajole. He just looked at her, his expression calm, steady, as though he already knew the decision she'd made wasn't final, that this fragile denial was just a temporary reprieve, a brief pause before the inevitable. And maybe, deep down, she knew it too. She went to bed that night with the ghost of his touch still lingering on her skin, a phantom warmth that refused to dissipate. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, the city lights casting long shadows across her room, her mind replaying every moment, every touch, every glance. The way he'd looked at her, the way his hands had felt on her waist, the way she had let it happen, had actively, willingly participated in the transgression. She hated herself for it, for the weakness, for the betrayal, for the descent into forbidden territory. But the worst part, the most terrifying part, was that she couldn't stop thinking about it. About him, about the intoxicating thrill of the kiss, about what it would feel like if she let it happen again, if she surrendered completely to the forbidden desire that had awakened within her. It's strange how easily a line can be crossed, how quickly boundaries can blur. One moment you're standing at the edge, clinging to the illusion of control, convincing yourself you'd never take that final step, that you're stronger than temptation. And the next, you're tumbling forward, propelled by an irresistible force, powerless to stop the descent. That's how it felt with Jake. After that night in the living room when his lips brushed hers and she didn't pull away, everything shifted. The unspoken tension that had been simmering between them for days finally boiled over, erupting in a sudden, uncontrollable blaze. There was no denying it anymore. They had crossed a line she'd told herself she would never approach, and now, teetering on the other side, she wasn't sure she wanted to go back. At first, she told herself it wouldn't happen again. She avoided him, retreating to her bedroom like a guilty teenager, a self-imposed exile, and throwing herself into her work, burying herself under a mountain of manuscripts, hoping to suffocate the rising tide of desire. She filled her days with endless editing projects, mindless tasks around the house, anything to keep from being alone with him, to maintain the fragile illusion of normalcy. But it didn't matter. Avoidance wasn't enough. Jake was always there, a constant, inescapable presence. She'd hear him moving around in the kitchen, the faint clink of dishes as he made himself coffee, the mundane sounds amplifying her awareness of him. She'd see him outside through the window, working in the small patch of garden behind the brownstone, his shirt off on warmer days, sweat glistening on his skin, the casual display of his physicality a constant silent provocation. She'd pass him in the hallway, their bodies brushing in the narrow space, a fleeting, electrifying contact that sent shivers down her spine. And every time their eyes met, even for a fraction of a second, she felt it, that unspoken connection, that electric current, that invisible string that tied them together, pulling them closer despite her desperate attempts to resist. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when she finally broke. The rain had been coming down in sheets all day, a relentless New York downpour that turned the city into a watercolor painting, blurring the edges of reality, making the world feel smaller, quieter, more intimate. She had just finished a tense call with a particularly demanding author, her nerves frayed, her patience stretched thin. She was tired, restless, and completely on edge, the unspoken tension with Jake amplifying her general unease. She walked into the kitchen to make tea, hoping the comforting ritual would calm her frayed nerves, soothe the restless energy that vibrated beneath her skin. But the moment she turned the corner, she saw him. Jake was sitting at the kitchen table, bathed in the muted light filtering through the rain-streaked window, scrolling through his phone, his long fingers tapping against the screen. He looked up when she entered, his eyes locking onto hers, and something in her shifted, a subtle tremor deep within her core. She tried to ignore it, to push it down, focusing intently on the kettle as she filled it with water. The mundane task a desperate attempt to regain control. She set the kettle on the stove, the electric hum a fragile shield against the rising tide of tension. She could feel him watching her, his gaze steady, heavy, a physical weight in the small kitchen. But she refused to look at him, her eyes fixed on the stainless steel of the kettle, the cold, impersonal surface a stark contrast to the heat radiating from his presence. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft patter of rain against the windows, a rhythmic drumming that amplified the frantic beat of her own heart. She stood there, staring at the kettle, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, knuckles white, her heart pounding against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. Her skin tingled with a nervous energy she couldn't explain, a restless anticipation that both terrified and exhilarated her. Finally, she felt him move. The chair scraped softly against the linoleum floor as he stood up, the sound sharp and distinct in the quiet room. She didn't turn around, but she knew he was walking toward her, his presence a growing heat behind her. The kitchen felt smaller, hotter, the air thick with unspoken desire. She closed her eyes, her breath catching in her throat as she felt him stop behind her, his body a silent, imposing presence. He didn't touch her. Not yet, but his proximity was overwhelming, suffocating. She could feel the heat radiating off him, the subtle scent of his cologne, the barely perceptible tremor of his breath against her neck. "Sarah," he said softly, her name a whispered invocation, a low murmur that resonated deep within her. It wasn't a question, not a request, not even a statement. It was just her name, but the way he said it, low and deliberate, imbued with a weight of unspoken meaning, made her entire body tense, every nerve ending screaming in anticipation. She should have turned around and told him to stop, to step back, to retreat. She should have pushed him away, reminded him and herself that this was wrong, forbidden, a dangerous game they couldn't afford to play. But she didn't. She stayed frozen, her hands trembling against the cool, unforgiving surface of the counter, her body betraying her carefully constructed resolve. The kettle began to hum softly as it heated up, a low, vibrating sound that filled the room, but she barely heard it, lost in the suffocating intimacy of the moment. Then she felt it, his hand touching her waist, lightly at first, tentatively, as if he was still waiting for her to pull away, to break the spell, to reclaim the illusion of control. When she didn't, when she remained frozen, paralyzed by the intensity of the moment, his grip tightened, his fingers curling into the fabric of her shirt, pulling her closer, a silent invitation to cross the final threshold. Her heart was pounding so loudly she thought it might burst, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs, drowning out the humming of the kettle, the patter of the rain, everything but the overwhelming presence of him. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, she turned to face him. Jake's face was close, too close, his eyes searching hers, probing, questioning, looking for something she wasn't yet ready to name, something she was both terrified and desperate to give. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, ragged inhales and exhales that betrayed her inner turmoil. He lifted his other hand, his thumb brushing gently against her cheek, the feather-light touch sending a shiver of electric sensation through her. For a moment, suspended in time, she thought he would say something, that he would give her one last chance to stop this, to retreat from the brink. But he didn't. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, and the dam finally broke, the carefully constructed walls of resistance crumbling into dust. She kissed him back, the hesitant touch exploding into something deeper, more desperate, more consuming, as though they'd both been holding back for too long, teetering on the edge of a precipice and finally, willingly, jumping. His hands moved to her hips, pulling her closer, crushing her against him until there was no space left between them, her body molding to his, a perfect, terrifying fit. She felt weightless, dizzy, adrift in a sea of sensation, as his mouth moved over hers, his kiss igniting something inside her that she hadn't felt in years, a dormant fire suddenly roaring back to life. The kettle began to whistle, a sharp, high-pitched sound that filled the room, a shrill alarm shattering the fragile intimacy of the moment, but neither of them moved, lost in the forbidden embrace. Finally, she pulled back, breathless, her chest heaving, gasping for air, as she stared up at him, her eyes wide, pupils dilated, reflecting the storm that had just passed. His hands were still on her waist, his fingers warm and firm against her skin, the lingering touch a brand, marking her as his. She opened her mouth to say something, to break the spell, to retreat from the dangerous territory they'd just entered, but no words came out, her voice trapped in her throat, choked by the lingering heat of the kiss. Jake didn't say anything either. He just looked at her, his expression calm and steady, almost knowing, as though he'd known this would happen all along, that this moment was inevitable. For a long moment, the only sound was the insistent whistling of the kettle, still shrieking on the stove, a persistent reminder of the mundane world they'd just momentarily escaped. Then Jake let go of her, stepping back slowly, deliberately, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional chasm she knew was about to widen between them. "You should take care of that," he murmured, nodding toward the still whistling kettle, the mundane directive jarring against the intensity of what had just transpired. She blinked, startled, as though she'd forgotten where she was, disoriented, pulled back to reality by the shrill sound. She turned quickly, her hands trembling as she shut off the burner, the sudden silence amplifying the frantic beat of her heart. She moved the kettle to the side, the simple actions feeling clumsy and unreal, a stark contrast to the intimacy they'd just shared. When she turned back around, Jake was gone. She spent the rest of the day in a fog, moving through the motions of her life, but detached, disconnected. She couldn't focus on work, couldn't concentrate on anything beyond the memory of the kiss, the feel of his hands on her, the shocking intensity of her own response. She kept replaying the moment in her head, dissecting every detail, every touch, every glance, his hands on her waist, his lips on hers, the way she hadn't stopped him, the way she had actively, willingly kissed him back. She told herself it was a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment, that it couldn't happen again. But even as she said it, the denial felt hollow, unconvincing. She knew she was lying, not just to herself, but to the fragile remnants of her conscience. That kiss had set something in motion, a chain reaction she couldn't control, a dangerous game she'd willingly entered. She spent hours pacing the apartment, restless, on edge, jumping at every sound, every creak of the floorboards, waiting for Jake to reappear, to confront the aftermath of their shared transgression. But he didn't. His door stayed shut, a silent barrier between them, and the apartment felt emptier than it ever had, the silence amplifying the unspoken tension, the weight of what they'd done. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the city lights a distant, muted glow beyond her window, she could still feel him, his touch, his warmth, the lingering ghost of his lips against hers. She wanted to stop thinking about him, wanted to feel guilty, to remind herself that this was wrong. Forbidden, a betrayal of everything she'd believed in. But she didn't. She couldn't. The truth was, the terrifying, exhilarating truth was that she didn't want to stop. And that realization terrified her more than anything else. It would be easy to say she didn't know how it happened, that she was swept up in something she couldn't control, a tide of desire that overwhelmed her better judgment. But that would be a lie, a convenient self-deception. The truth is, she let it happen, again and again, each time telling herself it was the last, a fleeting moment of weakness, a momentary lapse in control. But she never meant it. The line that they had crossed didn't matter anymore. The boundary blurred beyond recognition. Because once she tasted what Jake offered, attention, desire, the intoxicating feeling of being seen, truly seen for the first time in years, she couldn't let it go. And he didn't let her. The days blurred together after the kiss in the kitchen, a hazy, dreamlike sequence of stolen moments and unspoken desires. She avoided him at first, or at least she pretended to, maintaining a fragile facade of normalcy, a thin veil of denial. But it was all for show, a charade they both played, knowing the underlying truth, the simmering tension that crackled between them, growing louder, more insistent, every time they were in the same room. He didn't push her, didn't say a word about what had happened, didn't force a confrontation. Instead, he let the silence speak for him, his eyes lingering on her a little too long, his hand brushing against her back as he walked by, a casual touch that sent electric shocks through her system, his presence filling whatever space she occupied, a constant, inescapable reminder of the forbidden territory they now shared. She had been starved for so long, starved for affection, for attention, for desire, that even the smallest touch felt electric, a spark in the darkness. It was a Saturday afternoon when she broke again, when the fragile walls of her resistance finally crumbled completely. Mark had been gone for days, wrapped up in meetings and work trips, his absences so frequent and prolonged they had become the new normal, a silent testament to the gaping chasm that had opened between them. She was in the sunroom, a bright, airy space that usually offered solace, flipping aimlessly through a book, the pages blurring before her eyes, her mind a million miles away. The house was quiet, the city sounds muffled by the closed windows, but she knew she wasn't alone. She could feel Jake's presence somewhere nearby, an almost psychic awareness, a constant, low-level hum beneath the surface of her consciousness. It had become a habit now. This strange, heightened awareness of him, the way her pulse quickened, her breath hitched, whenever she knew he was close, a Pavlovian response to his proximity. When she glanced up, he was there. Jake stood in the doorway, framed by the bright sunlight streaming in from the garden, his hands in his pockets, watching her with that same unreadable expression that made her stomach twist with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air, thick with desire and forbidden longing. She set the book down, her hands trembling slightly as she looked at him, her gaze drawn to his, magnetically, irresistibly. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the silence between them louder than anything either of them could have said, a silent conversation conducted through glances and unspoken desires. Then he stepped forward, crossing the threshold, entering her space, her carefully constructed world of denial. She should have stopped him. She should have told him to leave, to go back to his room, to let her pretend for just a little longer that this wasn't happening, that she wasn't on the verge of surrendering completely to the forbidden desire that threatened to consume her. But she didn't. She couldn't. Her will fractured, her resolve dissolving in the heat of his gaze. It started slowly, tentatively at first, his hands brushing her shoulders as he stood behind her, his fingers warm and steady as they lingered, caressing, longer than they should have, longer than was acceptable. Her breath caught, a shallow, involuntary gasp as his touch moved lower, grazing her arms, tracing the delicate skin, pulling her gently to her feet until she was facing him. Inches apart, the air between them crackling with unspoken energy, heavy and charged like a summer storm waiting to break. Her chest was tight, constricted, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst through her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. She met his eyes, dark, intense, certain, unflinching, and she felt something in her give way, a final surrender to the inevitable. When his lips met hers, there was no hesitation, no resistance, no turning back. The kiss was hungry, desperate, filled with all the things they hadn't said, all the tension they'd been pretending didn't exist, a physical manifestation of the unspoken desires that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her closer, crushing her against him until her body was molded to his, the hard planes of his chest pressing against her, the heat radiating off him, enveloping her in a forbidden embrace. She felt his strength, his desire, his unwavering focus, and for the first time in years, she let herself stop thinking, stop analyzing, stop questioning. It didn't matter where they were or what they were doing or how wrong it was, how dangerous. All that mattered was the way his hands moved over her, the way he kissed her, like he couldn't get enough, like she was something he wanted, something he desired, something he needed. She didn't feel invisible anymore. It wasn't just that one time. Once the dam had broken, once they had crossed that forbidden line, they couldn't stop themselves. Eli sought her out constantly, drawn to her with an irresistible pull, a magnetic force that defied logic and reason. Quiet moments stolen when Mark was out of the house, late nights when the city fell silent and the world felt still. Hushed afternoons when sunlight poured through the windows, bathing the apartment in a golden, surreal light, creating a dreamlike atmosphere that blurred the lines between reality and fantasy. They were reckless, careless, driven by a desperate hunger, a forbidden desire that overrode all sense of caution. One afternoon, as she was folding laundry in the guest bedroom, a forgotten chore she'd been neglecting for days, she heard the door click softly behind her, the subtle sound sending a jolt of adrenaline through her veins. She didn't need to turn around to know it was him. She felt it. That familiar pull, that electric current, that unspoken connection that made her pulse race, her breath catch in her throat. Eli didn't say anything as he crossed the room, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. She felt his hands on her waist before she even turned to face him, pulling her back against him, his body a warm, solid presence behind her. Her breath hitched, a shallow gasp, as his lips brushed her neck, the feather-light touch sending shivers down her spine, her hands trembling as the clean, folded laundry slipped from her grasp, tumbling to the floor, forgotten. Later, as she lay beside him in the tangled sheets of the guest bed, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room, she stared up at the ceiling, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths as she tried to steady her breathing, to regain some semblance of composure. Eli's arm was draped lazily across her stomach, his fingers tracing soft, aimless circles on her skin, the casual intimacy a stark contrast to the forbidden nature of their encounter. She knew she should feel guilty, knew she should stop this dangerous game before it spiraled completely out of control. But she didn't. She couldn't. The pull was too strong, the desire too overwhelming. They stole moments wherever they could, snatched fragments of time from the edges of their carefully constructed lives. Quiet encounters that left her breathless and shaken, hidden in plain sight, daringly, recklessly. Once, in the early hours of the morning before the city began to stir, she slipped downstairs to make coffee while Mark was still asleep, shrouded in the oblivious comfort of his slumber. She was standing on the kitchen counter, waiting for the kettle to boil, the silence of the pre-dawn hours amplifying her heightened senses, when Eli came up behind her, his footsteps silent, ghost-like. He didn't say anything, didn't speak, didn't break the fragile silence. He just placed a hand on the small of her back, his touch light, almost imperceptible, but deliberate, undeniably possessive, his fingers grazing the curve of her waist beneath her robe, a silent claim. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, her body tensing, her senses heightened, every nerve ending screaming in awareness. She stared down at the countertop, her hands trembling against the cool marble, fighting the overwhelming urge to lean back into his touch, to surrender completely to the forbidden intimacy. "Eli," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a breath against the silence, her name a plea, a warning, a desperate attempt to regain control. He didn't respond, didn't acknowledge her whispered protest. He didn't need to. His touch lingered for just a moment longer, a silent message, a promise of more to come, before he walked away, disappearing back into the shadows, leaving her there with her heart racing, her cheeks burning, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and desire. They were playing a dangerous game, a game with no rules, no boundaries, no safe word, and they both knew it. She started noticing the change in him too, the subtle shift in his demeanor, the growing confidence in his gaze. Eli wasn't the boy she had watched grow up, the awkward teenager navigating the complexities of adolescence. He was a man now, undeniably, irrevocably a man, confident, strong, and deliberate in a way that made her stomach twist with equal parts excitement and fear. There was a possessiveness in the way he looked at her now, a quiet certainty, a silent claim that sent shivers down her spine, a thrill of forbidden electricity. It scared her sometimes, the intensity of it, the unwavering focus of his gaze, the unspoken demands in his touch. But it thrilled her too, ignited a spark in her that had long been dormant, a flicker of desire she thought had been extinguished years ago. When they were alone, in those stolen moments, those secret encounters, he made her feel like she was the only woman in the world, the sole object of his desire, his unwavering attention, and she let him, willingly, desperately, surrendering to the intoxicating illusion. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the New York skyline in hues of gold and crimson, and the apartment was bathed in warm, ethereal light, She stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes, the mundane task a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within her. Mark was away again, another important meeting, another business trip that didn't concern her, that didn't include her, that only served to widen the chasm between them. She didn't hear Eli approach, didn't sense his presence until he was right behind her, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his body. His hand slid around her waist, possessive, insistent, pulling her back against him, his body molding to hers, the familiar contact sending a jolt of electric sensation through her. She felt the heat of his breath on her neck, his lips grazing her skin, sending shivers down her spine as her heart began to race, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. "You shouldn't," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a fragile protest, even though she didn't move, didn't pull away, didn't resist his embrace. His grip on her tightened, his fingers digging into her waist, his voice low, husky, a murmur in her ear that sent a shiver of anticipation through her. "Do you want me to stop?" She closed her eyes, her body betraying her carefully constructed resolve as she leaned into him, surrendering to the forbidden embrace, her hands gripping the edge of the counter to steady herself, to keep herself from falling completely into the abyss. "No," she whispered, the denial weak, unconvincing, a fragile surrender. And just like that, she let herself fall again, willingly, desperately, embracing the forbidden, the dangerous, the intoxicating. It wasn't a question of right or wrong anymore, morality blurring into insignificance. It was a question of when, not if, everything would come crashing down, when their carefully constructed secret would shatter, when the fragile illusion would dissolve, because deep down, in the quiet corners of her mind, she knew it couldn't last. They were reckless, careless, blinded by desire, and sooner or later someone would notice, someone would see, someone would expose them. And when they did, the fallout would be devastating, the consequences irreparable. Things that are forbidden always burn the brightest, fueled by the very fact of their prohibition. Maybe that's why she ignored every warning sign, every whisper in her head telling her this couldn't last, that they were playing with fire, that they were dancing on the edge of a precipice. In those weeks stolen from the fabric of their lives, Eli and she moved like ghosts through the apartment, two people pretending life hadn't completely changed, pretending the unspoken tension wasn't a tangible force in the air, pretending they weren't hurtling towards a catastrophic collision. They stole hours, stolen kisses behind closed doors, stolen touches in the dark, hidden from prying eyes, shrouded in secrecy. She convinced herself it was just for them, that as long as they were careful, discreet, no one would ever know, their secrets safe within the confines of their apartment, their private world. But she underestimated just how fragile secrets are, how easily they can unravel, how quickly they can shatter under the weight of reality. It started with something small, insignificant, a forgotten shirt, a careless oversight. It was early one morning, the city still shrouded in pre-dawn darkness, and she was tidying up the guest room, the scene of their most recent transgression, where Eli had slept the night before. Mark had left at dawn for another early meeting, another day away from her, and she knew Eli wouldn't wake for at least another hour, giving her time to erase the traces of their forbidden encounter. The sheets were rumpled, still warm from where they'd tangled themselves in them just a few hours earlier. The lingering scent of their bodies clinging to the fabric, a silent testament to their reckless abandon. She folded them carefully, smoothing out the creases, trying to erase the evidence of their passion, the lingering scent of sin. That's when she saw it. A black t-shirt thrown carelessly over the back of the chair, a stark black stain against the pale linen upholstery. It was Eli's, undeniably his, a familiar garment she'd seen him wear countless times. The sight of it made her breath catch in her throat, a sudden constriction of fear. She grabbed it quickly, her hands trembling, her heart pounding against her ribs, and stuffed it into the laundry hamper, burying it beneath a pile of towels, hoping to hide the incriminating evidence. But the fear had already taken root, a seed of paranoia planted in the fertile ground of her guilt. Mark hadn't stepped foot in this room in months, had no reason to enter the guest bedroom, their lives having diverged into separate orbits long ago. But she knew it only took one moment of carelessness, one slip-up, one forgotten shirt, for everything to fall apart, for their fragile secret to shatter, for their carefully constructed world to come crashing down around them, and they were being careless, reckless, blinded by desire, ignoring the mounting warning signs. The second crack appeared 2 days later, more insidious, more unsettling. She was at the gallery, struggling to concentrate on a manuscript she was reviewing, her mind wandering, her thoughts consumed by Eli, by the forbidden intimacy they now shared. The words on the page blurred before her eyes. meaningless symbols against the white paper. Her phone buzzed, a sudden vibration that startled her out of her reverie. She reached for it absent-mindedly, assuming it was Mark checking in, a perfunctory call from his endless business trip. But it wasn't. It was a message, an anonymous number, a text message that sent a chill of ice water through her veins. "I know what you're doing." Her heart stopped. A sudden, terrifying silence in her chest. She stared at the screen, the words blurring, swimming before her eyes as her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She read it again and again, hoping it was a mistake, a prank, a wrong number, a cruel joke. But she knew better. The cold, impersonal text, the anonymous sender, the chillingly specific accusation. She knew it was real, undeniably, terrifyingly real. The phone slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering onto the polished surface of her desk, the sound echoing in the sudden silence of the gallery office. Her pulse raced, a frantic, panicked rhythm as a wave of nausea washed over her. Panic began to set in, a suffocating tide of fear and dread. Who was it? Who knew? Someone from the neighborhood? A disgruntled acquaintance? A jealous friend? Could Mark know? Had he somehow found out? The possibilities swirled through her mind, a chaotic vortex of paranoia and fear. She forced herself to breathe, deep, ragged inhales and exhales, trying to regain some semblance of composure, to think rationally, to find a logical explanation. It was probably nothing, she told herself. A coincidence, a cruel joke from some anonymous troll, someone who didn't even know her, didn't know her life, didn't know her secret. But deep down, a cold, hard voice of truth whispered in the back of her mind. Someone had seen them. Someone had witnessed their forbidden intimacy. Someone knew. When she got home that evening, the apartment felt different, colder, more ominous, as if a shadow had crept into every corner, tainting the familiar spaces with an invisible stain of dread. Eli was sitting in the living room, watching something on television, his face illuminated by the flickering screen, his posture relaxed, deceptively casual. But when she walked in, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and she saw a flicker of something in his gaze, a question, a wariness, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken tension that now permeated every room. She didn't say a word, couldn't. Her throat constricted, her voice trapped somewhere deep inside her chest. She set her keys on the entryway table, the clatter echoing too loudly in the strained silence, and disappeared upstairs, retreating to the sanctuary of her bedroom, shutting the door behind her with a soft click, a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. She leaned against the closed door, her back pressed against the cool wood, trying to steady herself, to calm the frantic beating of her heart. The anonymous message rattled inside her head like a ticking clock, counting down the seconds until their secret exploded, until their carefully constructed world shattered into pieces. Someone knew, someone had to know. It wasn't just the message either. It was everything. The subtle, insidious shift in the atmosphere, the growing sense of unease, the constant feeling of being watched. She started noticing things, subtle, tiny things that most people wouldn't even think twice about, fleeting glimpses at the edge of her peripheral vision, half-heard sounds in the distance. A curtain moved in a neighbor's window when she walked into a room, a car parked down the street that didn't belong to any of the neighbors, a friend's lingering glance during an otherwise innocent conversation, a subtle shift in tone, a veiled question in their eyes. Paranoia took hold of her, tightening its grip with every passing day, every anonymous message, every fleeting glance, every unexplained sound, until it became a suffocating weight, crushing her under the burden of her secret, her guilt, her fear. It wasn't long before the third crack appeared, shattering the fragile illusion of control completely, tearing through the carefully constructed facade of normalcy. This time it wasn't subtle, wasn't ambiguous, wasn't easily dismissed as paranoia or imagination. This time it was real, undeniable, devastatingly concrete. Mark came home earlier than expected, unexpectedly early, on a Friday evening, catching her completely off guard, unprepared, vulnerable. She hadn't seen the headlights sweep across the living room windows, hadn't heard the familiar rumble of his car pulling into the driveway, hadn't sensed his imminent arrival. She was in the kitchen with Eli, standing too close to him, her hand brushing against his arm as they talked. A casual, innocent touch that suddenly felt charged with forbidden intimacy. And then she heard it, the sharp, distinct clearing of a throat. A sound that froze her blood in her veins, that shattered the fragile intimacy of the moment. She froze, her heart stopping, her breath catching in her throat. Eli stepped back quickly, instinctively, his face shifting, hardening into a neutral mask, his eyes widening with a flicker of alarm. But it was too late. the damage was done, the illusion shattered. She turned slowly, agonizingly slowly, her body stiff with dread, her heart pounding in her ears, to see Mark standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading evening light, his briefcase still clutched in his hand, his eyes narrowed, his gaze moving between the two of them, taking in the scene, piecing together the unspoken narrative, the forbidden truth. For a long moment, no one said anything. The silence stretched, suffocating, heavy with unspoken accusations, with dawning realization. "Didn't expect you home so soon," she said finally, forcing her voice to sound normal, casual, a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, to deflect the impending storm. Mark's gaze lingered on her for a moment too long, cold, hard, assessing, before he finally set the briefcase down on the floor with a heavy thud, the sound echoing in the strained silence. He muttered something about traffic, about an earlier flight, about a change of plans, the words perfunctory, meaningless, a flimsy veil over the storm brewing beneath the surface. He didn't look at Eli again, didn't acknowledge his presence directly, but the tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife, a silent accusation hanging heavy in the air. Dinner that night was unbearable, a strained, awkward charade of forced normalcy. Mark barely spoke, his silence more damning than any accusation, his eyes occasionally flicking toward her or Eli, assessing, judging, as if trying to piece together the fragments of a shattered truth, to understand the depth of her betrayal. She told herself it was just her imagination, her paranoia spiraling out of control, that he didn't know anything, couldn't possibly know, that it was just a coincidence, an unfortunate timing, a misunderstanding. But deep down, a cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. She could feel it, the tension crackling in the air like static electricity, the unspoken accusations, the dawning realization in Mark's eyes. They weren't being careful anymore, not careful enough, and someone, sooner or later, was going to catch them. It happened a week later, the final, devastating blow that shattered everything, leaving nothing but ashes in its wake. The apartment was quiet that night, a false sense of tranquility masking the storm that was about to erupt. Mark was in his office, working late as usual, the endless demands of his corporate life keeping him distant, preoccupied, oblivious to the turmoil brewing beneath his roof. Eli was in the garage, tinkering with his car, the sounds of metal clanking and tools scraping filtering faintly through the closed windows, a mundane soundtrack to the impending catastrophe. She was in the living room pacing restlessly, her nerves on edge, her anxiety mounting, as she tried to convince herself that everything was fine, that it was just her paranoia, that she was imagining things, that the anonymous messages, the suspicious glances, Mark's strange behavior were all just figments of her overactive imagination. And then she heard it, the sharp, decisive slam of the front door, echoing through the quiet apartment, a sound that jolted her to her core, that shattered the fragile illusion of calm. "Clara!" Mark's voice, raw with anger, booming through the stillness, a thunderclap in the silence. She froze, her heart stopping, her breath seizing in her lungs as the sound of his footsteps echoed through the hallway, heavy, deliberate, menacing. When he appeared in the doorway, his face was red, contorted with rage, his eyes wild, bloodshot, burning with fury. He was holding something in his hand, a manila envelope, thick and heavy, the contents unknown, but undeniably ominous. "Who is it?" he demanded, his voice a guttural growl, throwing the envelope onto the coffee table with a violent force, the papers inside scattering across the polished surface. "What?" Her voice was barely a whisper, a fragile breath against the storm raging around her. "Don't play games with me, Clara. Who is it?" He leaned closer, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and ragged on her skin. "Who is he?" She stared at the envelope, the manila paper suddenly terrifying, the contents unknown but undeniably damning. Her hands shaking uncontrollably, she reached for it, her fingers trembling as she tore open the flap, revealing the contents within. Inside were photos, grainy black and white images, stark and undeniable. Photos of her and Eli. On the couch in the living room, tangled together in the guest bedroom. A stolen kiss in the kitchen, a casual touch in the hallway. Proof. Irrefutable, undeniable proof of her betrayal, laid bare in stark black and white. "I found this in the mailbox today," Mark said, his voice low and trembling, barely contained rage simmering beneath the surface. "Who sent it? How long has this been going on?" She couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The room was spinning, tilting on its axis, the familiar furniture blurring around her, the apartment suddenly alien, hostile, suffocating. All she could do was stare at the photos, the grainy images of her secret life, her forbidden desires, the life she'd tried so desperately to keep hidden, now laid bare, exposed, undeniable. Then Eli appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, by the raw anger in Mark's voice. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice calm, deceptively so, but guarded, wary, his eyes scanning the scene, taking in the tension, the photos scattered on the coffee table, Mark's contorted face, her own pale, stricken expression. Robert turned to look at him, his expression darkening, his face twisting with a mixture of rage and disgust as understanding clicked into place, the pieces of the puzzle finally fitting together to form a devastatingly clear picture. "You," he spat, the single word venomous, laced with contempt. "It's you, isn't it?" Eli didn't deny it, didn't argue, didn't say anything at all. His silence was an admission, more damning than any confession. Robert turned back to her, his face twisted with disgust, his eyes burning with a cold, unforgiving fury. "You've been sleeping with him," he said, the words hanging in the air, heavy, accusatory, shattering the fragile remnants of her carefully constructed world. "My son." She opened her mouth to speak, to deny, to explain, to plead for understanding, for forgiveness, but no words came out. Her throat constricted, her voice failing her, choked by shame, by guilt, by the devastating finality of the moment. There was nothing she could say to fix this, no words that could undo the damage, no explanation that could make him understand, that could justify her betrayal. "You disgust me," Robert said quietly, his voice low, trembling, devoid of emotion, the words hitting harder than any shout, any accusation, any display of rage. She wanted to shout back, to defend herself, to tell him it wasn't that simple, that Eli had made her feel alive, vital, desired, in a way she hadn't felt in years, that he had awakened something dormant within her, that he had seen her, truly seen her for the first time in a long time. But the truth wouldn't matter to him. Nothing she could say could bridge the chasm that had opened between them, could erase the betrayal, could undo the damage. He turned abruptly and stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him with a force that rattled the windows, leaving a gaping hole in the silence, a void filled with the echoes of his rage, the shards of their shattered life. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece, counting down the seconds to the final, inevitable collapse. Then Eli spoke, his voice low, soft, but certain, cutting through the deafening silence. "It doesn't matter what he thinks." She looked at him, her chest tight with pain, tears streaming down her face, hot and heavy against her skin. "It's over, Eli," she whispered, the words barely audible, a fragile admission of defeat. He stepped forward, his voice soft but insistent, unwavering in its certainty. "It doesn't have to be." But she knew it did. In the weeks that followed, everything fell apart, unraveling with devastating speed. Robert filed for divorce, the legal papers arriving with cold, impersonal formality, a final, official severing of their intertwined lives. He moved out of the apartment, leaving her alone in the echoing silence, the rooms feeling emptier than ever, haunted by ghosts of what was and what could have been. People talked. Whispers followed her everywhere she went, a constant, insidious hum of judgment and condemnation. She avoided the neighbors, avoided the gallery, avoided everything and everyone, retreating into the isolation of her apartment, a self-imposed exile. Eli stayed for a while, lingering in the wreckage of their shattered lives, but it wasn't the same. The fire that had burned so brightly, so fiercely between them had turned to ash, tainted by guilt, by shame, by the wreckage they had created. One day, she came home to find his bags packed, neatly stacked by the door, a silent announcement of his departure. "Where will you go?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper, the question more for herself than for him. He shrugged, a casual, indifferent gesture that belied the weight of their shared history. "Somewhere else?" She watched him walk out the door, disappearing down the hallway, feeling the finality of it settle like a stone in her chest, heavy, cold, immovable. Now, as she sits here alone in the quiet apartment, the city lights a distant hum beyond her window, she can't say she regrets what happened. She should, logically, morally, ethically, but she doesn't. Eli made her feel something she didn't think she could feel anymore, something vital, something intoxicating, wanted, alive, seen. But the cost was everything. And some nights, when the apartment is silent, the city sounds fading into a distant murmur, she wonders if it was worth it, if the fleeting moments of passion, the stolen kisses, the forbidden intimacy were worth the devastating price she ultimately had to pay.